The plate was already set before anyone sat down. Louisa Kendrick stood in the doorway of the Bancroft ranch house and could not move. Her boots were caked with red Colorado dust, her traveling coat torn at the left shoulder from where she had caught it on the stag coach door latch, and her hair had given up every pin it had been holding since Pueblo. She had arrived late, the way she always arrived late, because nothing in her life had ever cooperated with a schedule, and she had fully expected to find the supper table abandoned, the food cold, the man she had agreed to marry irritated at best and insulted at worst. Instead, she found a little boy of no more than 7 years, sitting ramrod straight in a chair with a cloth napkin folded across his lap, staring at an empty place setting directly across from him with the solemnity of a church deacon. The candles on the table were lit. Her plate had bread on it. Her water glass was full. Her chair had been pulled out slightly, as though someone had just risen from it a moment ago and might return at any second. The boy looked up at her. He did not look startled. He did not look confused. He looked at her the way people look at someone they have been expecting for a very long time, and his expression said, plainly and without any decoration, that her being late had not surprised him in the least and that it had not changed anything either. "You are Miss Kendrick," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said carefully, still holding the door frame. "Papa said supper would be ready at 6. He glanced at the small clock on the mantelpiece. It is almost 8. "I know," she said. The stage was delayed. There was a problem at Raton Pass. The boy nodded once. "I know about Raton Pass. Papa used to take that route when he went to Santa Fe for cattle business." He looked back at her empty plate, and something in his face shifted, something that went deeper than a 7-year-old ought to be able to carry. "He always kept your place set," the boy said quietly. "Even on the evenings you had not yet arrived." The words hit her somewhere she had not expected to be hit, not in the polite, practical part of herself that had made the rational decision to answer Andrew Bancroft's advertisement in the Denver newspaper. Not in the cautious, guarded part that had written 3 careful letters before agreeing to come, but in the older, softer, more frightened part of herself that had almost not come at all. "He kept my place set," she repeated. "Every evening," the boy said, "since the first letter." She stared at the child across the candle-lit table, at the bread on her plate and the full water glass and the pulled-out chair, and she felt something break open quietly in her chest, like a window being unlatched in a room that had been shut for too long. She was 6 weeks away from 30 years old. She had buried a mother and a broken engagement and a business that had failed in Denver when the silver market collapsed in 1893, and she had told herself, firmly and without sentimentality, that she was coming to Cimarron, New Mexico territory for practical reasons only. A fresh start. Stability. A ranch that needed a woman who could manage accounts and a household, not for romance, not for anything so dangerous as hope. Andrew Bancroft's son looked at her across the candle-lit table with his napkin folded in his lap, and she understood with sudden and terrifying clarity that she had already made a catastrophic miscalculation. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Her name had been Louisa Kendrick for all 29 years of her life, and she had been practical for most of them. She had been born in 1864, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father and a woman who had come west from Ohio with a trunk full of books and a complete inability to distinguish between optimism and recklessness, which was a trait Louisa had inherited and spent the better part of a decade trying to suppress. She had grown up in Denver when it was still a rough and gasping city finding its shape, had taught herself bookkeeping from her father's ledgers after he died of a fever in 1882, had worked for 4 years in a dry goods merchant's office, and had been engaged, briefly and disastrously, to a man named Franklin Hughes who had turned out to have a wife already in Kansas City. She had not told anyone about Franklin Hughes. She had folded that particular humiliation into a very small square and put it somewhere she did not look. The silver market collapse of 1893 had taken her employer's business and her position with it, and by the spring of 1894 she had been $32, a rented room, and 3 months from destitution. She had read Andrew Bancroft's advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News on a Tuesday morning, sitting at a table in a coffee house with the newspaper and nothing else. Widow rancher, 41 years of age, operating cattle concern in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, seeks woman of good character and practical disposition for companionship and partnership in household management. 1 child, son, 7 years. Correspondence welcome. She had read it 3 times. She had told herself she was not going to write. She had written the same evening because Louisa Kendrick had many excellent qualities, but self-deception had never reliably been one of them. His first reply had come 2 weeks later, and it had surprised her. She had expected something like her advertisement response, something businesslike and careful. What she received instead was a letter written in a large, slightly uneven hand that suggested a man more comfortable with physical work than with a pen. But the words themselves were precise and honest in a way she had not anticipated. He told her about the ranch, yes, about the cattle operation, about the house which needed work and which he lacked time to give it. But he also told her about his son, Caleb, who was quiet and observant, and who had not recovered fully from losing his mother 2 years prior. And Andrew Bancroft wrote about his son with such plain-spoken, unguarded tenderness that Louisa had to set the letter down and look out her window for a full minute before she could continue. He did not promise her anything except honesty. He told her his flaws openly, as a man presenting an accounting. He was not demonstrative by nature. He worked too many hours. He had a temper that ran cold rather than hot, which he believed was worse than a hot temper because it lasted longer and was harder to read. He told her the ranch was 53 miles from Cimarron proper, and that winters in the Sangre de Cristo mountains were not forgiving. She had written back and told him her own accounting. She was opinionated. She kept her own counsel to a degree that some found unfriendly. She had very little patience for dishonesty in any form, and she had no experience with cattle or with rural living, but she was a quick learner and she was not afraid of hard work. He had written back within the week. 3 letters had become 8, then 12. By the time she had agreed to come, she had read everything he had written so many times that she knew his handwriting the way she knew her own, and she had told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that this was practical correspondence between 2 adults entering a practical arrangement, and that the way she sometimes felt while reading his letters, that particular caught-breath, suspended feeling she had not felt since she was 19 years old and still foolish enough to believe in such things, was simply the relief of being seen clearly by another person, nothing more complicated than that. She had told herself that all the way from Denver to Pueblo on the train, and all the way from Pueblo to Raton on the stage, and most of the way from Raton down through the pass, and she had almost believed it. Then she had walked into his house and found his son keeping her place at the supper table, and practical arrangements had taken a sharp turn into something considerably more frightening. Andrew Bancroft came through the back door of the house 2 minutes after she sat down. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the plank floor of the kitchen, a low voice speaking to someone outside, then the creak of the door and the sound of it closing. He came into the dining room carrying a pot of something that smelled like beef stew, and he stopped when he saw her. She had, without quite meaning to, formed a mental image of him from his letters. She had pictured a man similar to Franklin Hughes, actually, though she had not consciously admitted this, a man who presented himself well and kept his real nature carefully hidden. She had expected someone pleasant and contained. Andrew Bancroft was not contained. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone gray at the temples and the kind of face that Colorado weather put on people, weathered deeply but cleanly, with lines around the eyes and mouth that came from squinting into distance rather than from dissipation. He was not handsome in any conventional way. His nose had been broken at least once. His hands, she noticed, were the largest hands she had ever seen on a person who was not actively performing physical labor, and one of them had a long scar along the back of it that ran from knuckle to wrist. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were dark brown and very direct, and they looked at her with an expression she had not expected from a man who had described himself as not demonstrative by nature. He looked at her the way his letters had sounded, plain-spoken and careful and entirely without pretense, and with something underneath that he was not quite managing to conceal, something that had the quality of relief. "Miss Kendrick," he said. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. There was a pause in which neither of them spoke, and in which Caleb watched them both with the vigilant attention of a small scientist observing a critical experiment. "You made it," Andrew said. "The pass was difficult," she said. "I apologize for the time." "Don't," he said simply, and set the pot on the table and sat down. "Caleb, will you say the grace?" The boy said grace with his eyes closed and his hands folded briefly and without ornamentation, and when he said amen he opened his eyes and looked at Louisa with an expression she was beginning to identify as characteristic. "Is it always that way at Raton Pass?" Caleb asked her. "I would not know," she said. "It was my first time." "Papa says it ices over in winter and you cannot get a wagon through at all." "That is true," Andrew said, serving stew into her bowl without asking, which she noticed. "Which is why we stock up in October." They ate. Louisa had expected the silence to be uncomfortable, but it was not quite. It had the quality of a silence between people who are paying attention to each other, which was different from the silence of people who have nothing to say. Andrew asked her about the journey. She asked him about the ranch. Caleb interjected occasionally with information he apparently felt was relevant, about the horses, about a particular cow named Harriet who had developed an opinion about fences, about the way the mountains looked in the morning when there was snow on the peaks. By the time they had finished eating, Louisa was aware of two things simultaneously. The first was that she was going to have to fundamentally renegotiate the terms of what she had thought she was doing here, because the practical distance she had planned to maintain between herself and this arrangement was already substantially breached, and she had been in the house for less than 2 hours. The second was that Andrew Bancroft was watching her across the table with the same expression she had caught him wearing when he first saw her, and she recognized it now, because she had seen its mirror image in the reflection in her coffee-house window 6 months ago. On the morning she had read his advertisement and told herself she was not going to write. It was the expression of someone who had not quite let themselves believe that a thing was real until the moment it stood in front of them. After supper, Caleb showed her to her room, which was clean and simply furnished and had a window that faced the mountains. Before he said good night, he stood in her doorway with a seriousness that she was already coming to think of as his natural mode of being and said, "I am glad you came, Miss Kendrick." She crouched down to be at his level and looked at him seriously in return. "I am glad to be here, Caleb," he nodded. Then he said with the casual precision of a child who has been thinking about something for a very long time and has finally decided to say it aloud, "Papa put fresh candles on the table every evening, even when you had not written that week. He said the table should be ready." She held his gaze. "He sounds like a very careful man." "He is," Caleb said. "He is the most careful man I know." Then he went to bed, and Louisa stood in her doorway and listened to the wind come down off the Sangre de Cristos, and felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain. The first week at the Bancroft Ranch was a study in careful distance and involuntary proximity. Louisa was a woman of her word. She had come to manage a household and she managed it. She rose at 5, which was earlier than she was accustomed to but which the ranch day required, and she made herself useful in every way she could identify. She was a competent cook, having fed herself for years in rented rooms with limited means, and she could follow a recipe or improvise from available materials without distress. She had her father's head for numbers, and she attacked Andrew's ranch accounts with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a proper problem to solve. Because the accounts were, as she had suspected from his letters, somewhat chaotic. She also spent time with Caleb, who had been tutored sporadically by a woman in town who came twice a week when weather permitted, and whose education had significant gaps that Louisa's teacher's daughter instincts found difficult to ignore. She began reading to him in the evenings and found that he was quick, genuinely quick, with the kind of mind that reaches ahead of the information it is given and wants to know what comes next. Andrew watched all of this. He was not a hovering man. He had real work and he did it, and she understood from the rhythm of the ranch that his work was physical and constant, and that the cattle operation he ran was significantly more complex than his letters had conveyed, because he had a way of understating his own competence that she was beginning to recognize. He employed 3 hands, men named Dory and Whitfield, and a young Mexican-American man everyone called Tomas, who was quiet and skilled, and who addressed Louisa from the first day with a courtesy that suggested he had decided to approve of her. But Andrew found reasons, small and plausible reasons, to be in the house at moments he had not been before. He came in for water in the afternoon and stayed to look at whatever she was working on. He adjusted her firewood situation unprompted. He showed her where things were stored with an attentiveness that went slightly beyond practicality, and he watched her with those dark, direct eyes that gave away more than he probably intended. On the 4th day, they had their first real disagreement. It was about the ranch accounts, specifically about a payment arrangement Andrew had made with a supplier in Cimarron that Louisa had identified, after 2 days of going through the ledgers, as significantly unfavorable to the ranch. "He is charging you 12 cents on the dollar above the market rate for grain," she said. She had the ledger open on the kitchen table and she was pointing at 3 years of entries with the controlled patience of a woman who has worked very hard not to simply say what she is thinking. "For 3 years. That is not a rounding error, Mr. Bancroft. That is a pattern." Andrew looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. "Edmonds has been supplying this ranch since my father's time." "Then he has been overcharging this ranch since your father's time," she said. A silence. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "I am aware. I would not make it if I had not verified it." She turned the ledger and showed him the comparative pricing she had written in the margin, drawn from 2 other suppliers' posted rates she had found in a trade circular. The numbers were unambiguous. He studied the numbers for a long moment. His face showed nothing in particular, which she had already identified as the cold temper he had warned her about, the contained kind that lasted. "I will speak to Edmonds," he said. "I would recommend ending the arrangement entirely," she said. "There are 2 suppliers in Taos who advertise better rates and I can write to them this week." Another pause. "You have been here 4 days, Miss Kendrick." "Yes," she said calmly. "But the numbers have been wrong for 3 years." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, and it settled, finally, into something that looked like the latter. "Write to Taos," he said. She wrote to Taos. The new arrangement was established by the end of the following month and saved the ranch a meaningful sum. Andrew did not say anything about this directly. But that evening, he poured 2 cups of coffee after supper and set one in front of her without asking, and when she looked up, he was reading the stock report from the Cimarron newspaper, and his expression was perfectly neutral, which was, she was learning, his version of a compliment. Caleb watched them both throughout this period with his characteristic vigilance. He was not a difficult child. He was a child carrying more than a child ought to carry, and he wore it the way his father wore things, quietly and without advertisement. His mother, Clara, had died of typhoid in the winter of 1892 when Caleb was 5. Andrew had mentioned this in one of his letters, briefly and without elaboration, in the way of a man who has put a thing away and keeps it in a specific place, and does not take it out often. But Caleb mentioned his mother sometimes, naturally, the way children mention things that are simply part of the landscape of their lives. And Louisa listened when he did, without discomfort, and without steering the conversation elsewhere, which she had the sense was not what he was accustomed to. The people around him, she suspected, became awkward when Clara came up, unsure how to handle it, and Caleb had learned to be careful about it. She was not careful. She asked him what his mother had been like. He looked at her with that serious, measuring expression. She was tall, he said, taller than most ladies, and she could whistle, really whistle like the men do, not just the soft kind. Papa always laughed when she whistled. What else? Louisa said. She smelled like the cedar chest in her room, Caleb said, and she used to read to me the same way you do, except she did all the voices differently. I would imagine, Louisa said. Everyone reads differently. Do you think she would have liked you? He asked with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are not asked. Louisa considered this honestly. I do not know. I hope so. I think I would have liked her. Caleb thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded, as if a verdict had been reached by internal committee, and went back to his book. Andrew, she did not know for several days, had been standing in the hallway outside Caleb's room during that conversation. She found out from Tomas, who had seen Andrew come out of the hallway with an expression Tomas described, with characteristic brevity, as different from usual. Louisa filed this information away and did nothing with it for the moment. On the 10th day, something happened that changed the particular quality of the distance between her and Andrew Bancroft. She had gone out in the early morning to hang washing, something she had taken over from the previous system which had been haphazard, and she had miscalculated the stability of the wooden stepladder she was using to reach the upper line. The ladder shifted. She caught herself partially, but came down hard on her left ankle on a patch of ground that was still half frozen from the previous night, and she sat down abruptly in the dirt with a sound that was more surprise than pain, though the pain arrived promptly. Andrew was there before she had fully registered what had happened. He came from the direction of the barn at a pace that was close to a run without quite being one, crouching down next to her with an expression that was the opposite of contained. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My ankle," she said. "I am all right. It was a foolish mistake." "Let me see it," he said, and before she could answer he had his hand around her boot carefully, and she felt the steadiness of his grip even through the leather. He checked the ankle with the competent attention of a man who has managed injuries far from medical help for many years, pressing carefully along the bone, and asked her where it hurt and where it did not. His face, she noticed, was very close to hers, and his expression was absolutely focused. "I do not believe it is broken," he said. "I did not believe it was either," she said. Her voice came out slightly less steady than she intended. He looked up at her then. Their faces were perhaps 18 inches apart, and his dark eyes held the same expression they had held on the first evening, and she understood, with the specific and slightly dizzying clarity of a woman who has spent 10 days convincing herself otherwise, that the careful, practical distance she had constructed was not going to survive him looking at her like that. "You should not have been using that ladder alone," he said. His voice was quiet. "Noted," she said. "I am not criticizing," he said. "I am saying I should have replaced that ladder 3 months ago and did not." There was a pause. "That is a very specific kind of apology," she said. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile but in the territory of one. "It is the only kind I am good at," he said. He helped her up. He was careful about it, thorough about it, and when he settled her weight against him briefly while she tested the ankle, she felt the solidity of him, the particular reliable largeness of a person who is fundamentally present in the physical world, and she noticed, distantly and with some frustration at herself, that she did not want him to let go. He let go. He walked her inside, made her sit, wrapped the ankle with the efficiency of long practice, and went back to work. At the door he stopped and said, without turning, "I will see about that ladder today." "I know you will," she said. He left. Louisa sat with her wrapped ankle and her coffee, and the morning sun coming through the window of the Bancroft ranch house, and she had, finally and without any further argument, the honesty of mind to admit to herself that she was in very serious trouble. She did not run from it. Louisa Kendrick had many flaws, but running from things was not among them, and she understood the landscape of her own interior sufficiently to know that the trouble she was in was not the dangerous kind. It was the other kind. The kind that felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and being afraid not because it might hurt you, but because you want it so much you have stopped being able to pretend that you do not. The following weeks had a rhythm to them that felt, to Louisa, like breathing. She learned the ranch. She walked the fence lines with Andrew on Sundays when the major work paused, and she learned which sections were solid and which were problematic, and where the water came from and where it went, and she learned the names of the cattle and the particular personalities of the horses, and she learned the way the mountains changed color through the day, and what it meant about the weather when certain clouds gathered over certain peaks. Andrew taught her these things the way he did everything, without excess, but with a thoroughness that told her he wanted her to actually know them, not just to appear to. She learned Caleb. Not slowly and at a careful distance, but the way you learn someone you genuinely like, by paying attention and caring about what you find. She taught him what she knew about mathematics and history and literature, and he taught her, with the dignity of someone sharing something real, about the natural world as he had come to understand it, about the way animal tracks read in snow, and what different bird calls meant, and the names of the stars his father had taught him. He was, she thought, going to be remarkable. He had the quality of someone who takes everything seriously but nothing personally, which is the rarest combination in the world. She was, she knew, also learning Andrew in the particular sideways fashion imposed by the situation, by the terms of an arrangement that had not yet named itself anything else. They were not married. They were not, technically, engaged. They were a practical arrangement in the process of determining whether it could become more than that, and the particular constraint of this was making Louisa mildly insane in a way she found somewhat humbling. She knew his habits. She knew that he rose before the sun every morning, and that the first thing he did was stand outside the back door of the house for 10 minutes with his coffee and look at the mountains, regardless of weather. She knew that he was, despite his stated cold temper, fundamentally inclined toward patience, and that the people around him felt it, because Dory and Whitfield were loyal to him in the undemonstrative way of men who do not say what they mean but whose actions are unambiguous, and Tomas openly admired him. She knew that he read, actually read, not widely but deeply, and that his small library of battered books was a map of his interior more accurate than anything he said aloud. She knew that he was funny, in a way that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly, a dry, precise humor that aimed at the exact right target and then retreated immediately, and that Caleb had inherited it and deployed it with even less warning. She knew that he was lonely. She knew it the way she knew her own loneliness, from the inside by recognition. He had managed 2 years with Caleb and the ranch and the hands and the town of Cimarron and its edges, and he had managed them well. And he was utterly alone in the way that people are alone when there is no one in the particular internal room that matters most. She knew, because she had begun to know him, that the letters he had written to her had been his version of opening a door. In the 4th week, on a Friday evening, Caleb fell asleep at the table over his supper. He had been out with Andrew all day helping with a fence repair, and he was simply done. Andrew lifted him without waking him, which said something about practice, and carried him to bed. Louisa cleared the table and washed the dishes, and when Andrew came back to the kitchen, she was standing at the window with a dish towel and a cup of coffee and the feeling of the evening settling around them. He sat down at the table. She brought him a second cup of coffee and sat across from him. "He had a good day," she said. "He did," Andrew said. "He works hard, always has, even at 5, 6 years old. Clara used to say he came out of the womb with an agenda." He said it simply, without the careful clearing of the throat that usually preceded Clara's name in other people's mouths, and Louisa took it the same way. What was she like, she asked, the way she had asked Caleb. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he said she was brave. That was the primary thing about her. Not reckless, there is a difference. She made decisions knowing the risk, and she made them forward, not sideways. He paused. She would have liked you. Louisa held his gaze. Caleb said the same thing. Caleb is correct, Andrew said. She had excellent judgment about people, usually better than mine. Another pause. I make decisions slowly. I turn things around a very long time before I commit to them. She used to find this maddening. I have noticed, Louisa said carefully, that you turn things around. His eyes met hers. Yes, he said, a silence that was of a different quality than the previous ones. Andrew, she said, and used his first name for the first time without thinking about it, and felt the slight shift in the air that it made. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes and did not look away. I came here for practical reasons, she said. I told myself that very firmly for approximately 100 miles of stage road. I would like to be honest with you, since honesty appears to be the thing we are both best at, and tell you that I am no longer certain that practical reasons are the primary ones. The silence stretched out for several seconds. I am aware, he said quietly, that this arrangement began as a practical one. I want to be honest with you in return, which is to say that it has not felt practical to me for considerably longer than I have had the courage to say so. Louisa set down her cup. Since when? She asked. He looked at her steadily. The fourth letter, he said. You told me you had no patience for dishonesty in any form, and you listed your own flaws the way an accountant lists debts, without excuse or deflection. I had not read anything like that from another person in my adult life. She was quiet for a moment. That was nearly 5 months ago. Yes, he said. You kept my place set at the table, she said, not quite a question. Every evening, he said, even when you did not know if I was coming. He held her gaze. Even then. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the Sangre de Cristo wind moving past the window, and she thought about 5 months of letters and a plate kept ready for someone who had not yet arrived, and she made a decision in the way that she made decisions, which was forward, not sideways. I think, she said, that we should stop treating this as an arrangement and call it what it actually is. Andrew Bancroft set down his coffee cup. What do you believe it actually is? She met his eyes without flinching. Something I was not prepared for, she said. Which is, given my general level of preparation for most things, somewhat significant. He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before. It was not the almost smile. It was the thing underneath that the almost smile was standing in front of, and it was, she thought, the most unguarded she had ever seen him. There is a preacher in Cimarron, he said, Reverend Marsh. He comes through the valley on Wednesdays. She raised an eyebrow. That is also a very specific kind of statement. I told you, he said quietly. It is the only kind I am good at. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she said, Wednesday then. The following Wednesday, she and Andrew Bancroft drove into Cimarron in the ranch wagon with Caleb between them and the mountains at their backs, and they were married in the front room of Reverend Marsh's house by a man in a dusty coat with a Bible that had his entire ministry written in the margins. It was not a formal wedding. She wore her second-best dress, which was dark blue wool, and Andrew wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and Caleb wore a jacket that was slightly too short in the sleeves and a very serious expression. Tomas and Dory came as witnesses. Dory cried, which surprised everyone including Dory. Reverend Marsh said the words, and they said their words, and Andrew put a ring on her finger that she later learned had belonged to his mother, which he had kept for this purpose without knowing for certain when the purpose would arise. And when the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Andrew cupped her face in those large, scarred hands and kissed her with careful, thorough attention, which was precisely how she had expected him to do everything. And then Caleb said quietly, "Good," and Tomas laughed. And that was their wedding. Married life in the Sangre de Cristo foothills in 1894 was not a sentimental business. There were fences to mend and cattle to manage and accounts to keep and weather to survive. And Louisa kept all of these things with the same efficiency she brought to everything. But it was also, in ways she had not predicted, something she could only describe as the most satisfied she had ever been, which was a word she had not previously associated with happiness, but which turned out to be more durable than the alternatives. She and Andrew found the language of each other gradually, as people do when they are both constitutionally inclined toward honesty but cautious about excess. He was, as he had warned her, not demonstrative in the conventional sense. He did not offer flowery speeches or sentimental declarations, and she had not wanted them. But he showed her what he meant in 100 small, consistent ways that added up to something larger and more convincing than declarations. He remembered what she told him. He asked her opinion on things and actually listened to the answer. He managed the tension of being wrong about something, which happened occasionally, with a directness that she found deeply attractive. He never raised his voice with her, not once, and when the cold temper arrived he told her it was there and walked it off, which was not a skill she had expected and which she respected enormously. And he loved her, she came to understand, with the same thoroughness with which he did everything else. Not urgently or desperately, but solidly, the way the mountains were solid, in a way that did not require performance to be real. She found herself in love with him in the way that people fall when they are past the age of being swept away by the falling, when they are old enough to recognize what it is and also what it costs, and they choose it anyway with full information. It was not the dizzy, consuming, frightening love of her younger years, the love that she had mistaken for certainty, and that had turned out to be projection. It was something quieter and more permanent, something that felt like the difference between a fever and a heartbeat. In November of 1894, she told him one morning before dawn, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, that she was expecting a child. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he set down his own cup and came to stand beside her at the window, and he looked out at the dark mountains and the first pale line of light on the horizon, and he put his arm around her carefully, the way he did everything, and pulled her against his side. "In the summer," he said. "June, I think," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." It was, she thought, the perfect word for the occasion. Caleb took the news with his characteristic seriousness. He thought about it for almost an entire day before delivering his verdict, which was that he thought it was acceptable, and that he would prefer a brother, but that he understood this was not within anyone's control. Louisa told him this was an impressively mature position, and he looked gratified. The winter of 1894 to 1895 was hard. Not catastrophically hard, not the kind of hard that broke people in the Sangre de Cristos, but the ordinary, relentless hard of high-altitude winters, with weeks of deep cold and ice on the water lines, and cattle that needed constant management and roads that became unreliable. Andrew was out more than in during the worst weeks, and Louisa, who was in her 5th and then 6th month and moving with somewhat less than her usual efficiency, ran the house and the accounts and Caleb's education with the focused determination of a woman who does not permit herself to be diminished by circumstance. There was one evening in January when a storm came down off the mountains with very little warning, and Andrew did not come in at his usual time. She did not say anything to Caleb about it. She made supper and set the table and put his plate in the usual place and kept the lamp in the window high. Caleb sat at his end of the table and ate his supper and did not say anything either, and she understood that he had done this before, kept the vigil in the quiet way, and that this was where he had learned about keeping places set for people who had not yet arrived. Andrew came in at 8:30, cold through and steady, and sat down to the supper she had kept warm without a word about the lateness, and she understood as she served him why he had kept her place at the table. It was not sentiment. It was faith, the active, tended kind. You kept the place ready because you believed the person was coming, and you did not let the belief go until there was actual reason to let it go, and you did not manufacture reasons that were not there. In the morning she told him about this understanding, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Yes, exactly that. In March, there was trouble. The trouble had a name. Harlan Cross, who was a land agent operating out of Springer, New Mexico territory, and who had been quietly buying up ranch land in the Cimarron Valley through a combination of legitimate purchase and less legitimate pressure. He had approached Andrew twice in the previous year, before Louisa's arrival, with offers for the Bancroft land, and Andrew had declined both times. Louisa found the correspondence when she was reorganizing the office, read it with the attention she gave all documents that passed through her hands, and understood immediately that the offers were not as straightforward as they appeared. She showed it to Andrew one evening. "He is buying through a shell company," she said, spreading the letters across the desk. "Look at the signature on the second letter, Consolidated Western Properties. That is not the name he introduced himself by." Andrew looked at the letters. "No," he said. "That suggests he does not want people to know what he is accumulating," she said, "which suggests the accumulation itself is the strategy. Someone is trying to consolidate this valley." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "Who is behind Consolidated Western Properties?" "I have written to a land title office in Denver," she said. "I should have an answer within 3 weeks." He looked at her across the desk. "You wrote to Denver?" "Yesterday," she said. "I hope you do not object." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I do not object." The answer came back in 2 weeks, not 3, because Louisa had written to a specific clerk she knew from her days in Denver who owed her something of a favor, and the answer was that Consolidated Western Properties was registered to a holding company in Santa Fe that was ultimately connected, through 2 intermediaries, to a railroad interest. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had announced a proposed spur line through the Cimarron Valley 18 months prior. The proposal had been quietly shelved. It had not, apparently, been abandoned. Andrew took this information to the other ranchers in the valley, specifically to a man named Porter Gill, who had been ranching there since before Andrew's father, and whose position in the community made him the natural center of any coordinated response. The ranchers met twice, at Porter's place and then at the Bancroft Ranch, and Louisa sat in on both meetings because she had the documents and the analysis, and the first time she thought there might be resistance to a woman sitting in on men's business, she was wrong. Porter Gill looked at her across his kitchen table, looked at the documents she had laid out and said, "Tell me what you found," and she told him. The coordinated response that followed was not dramatic. It was exactly the kind of thing that does not make for good stories, which was, everyone organized their land titles and recorded them properly. Several people who had been approached made formal complaints to the Territorial Land Office, and 2 ranchers who had already sold discovered that their sales contracts had irregularities that, with proper legal advice, could potentially be contested. Harlan Cross left the Cimarron Valley by April, and Consolidated Western Properties appeared to direct its attentions elsewhere, and no spur line was ever built through the valley, though the main railway continued to expand in other directions. It was not a battle with guns. There were no dramatic confrontations. It was a land and paper fight conducted in offices and kitchens, and Louisa Bancroft was largely responsible for winning it, and the ranchers of the Cimarron Valley knew this, and the ones who had initially found her presence at the table, a matter for adjustment, became the most vocal about the fact that the Bancroft Ranch had a woman who could read a land title like a hawk reads a field mouse. Andrew never said anything about this publicly. He did not need to. What he did was, 2 weeks after the last of the Cross business was resolved, show her a deed, the deed to the Bancroft Ranch. She was listed on it now as co-owner. She looked at it for a long moment. "When did you do this?" she asked. "January," he said. January, which was the month she had told him about the baby, and the month she had stood at the kitchen window and understood about keeping places set. "Andrew," she said. "It is your ranch," he said simply. "It has been since November." She looked at the deed and then at him, and she felt the particular expansion of feeling that she had learned by then to associate with being married to this man, the feeling of a room you thought you knew opening another door. She folded the deed carefully and put it in the strongbox with the other important documents, and then she went and found him where he was working in the barn, and she kissed him in a way that she had not managed, in the full winter with everything that had been happening, to do in some time. And Tomas, who was unfortunate enough to be present, became very interested in something that required his immediate attention on the other side of the barn. In June of 1895, their son was born. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a great deal of complaint, as though he had not wanted to leave wherever he had been and was registering this formally. And he was, when everything had settled, healthy and large and dark-haired like his father, with Louisa's specific expression of concentrated assessment, which Andrew pointed out immediately. "He already looks like he is finding fault with something," Andrew said, looking at the infant with an expression that was the most unguarded Louisa had ever seen on him. "He is 7 minutes old," Louisa said from the bed. She was exhausted in a way that was indistinguishable from satisfaction. "Even so," Andrew said. They named him Thomas James Bancroft, Thomas for Tomas, which made the man cry in the barn later when no one was supposed to be watching, and James for Louisa's father. Caleb came in to see his brother with the gravity of someone being introduced to a diplomatic delegation, assessed the infant with thoroughness, and announced that he looked acceptable. "I am glad you approve," Louisa said. "I was worried he might have red hair," Caleb said. "I find red hair disconcerting." "Thomas has opinions about this too," Andrew said, looking at the baby who was, at that moment, registering complaint again with considerable energy. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his brother very carefully. Thomas paused his complaint and appeared to look back, though at 7 minutes old this was probably optimistic attribution. Caleb touched the baby's hand with one finger, very gently, with the same careful thoroughness his father had for everything. "Hello," he said. Thomas closed his small fingers around Caleb's and did not let go. Caleb looked up at Louisa with an expression she had never seen from him before, something younger than he usually looked, something that did not have the habitual weight of 7-year-old gravity on it. "He likes me," he said. "He has excellent taste," Louisa said. Caleb looked back at Thomas and something in his face, in his small composed face that had been carrying too much for too long, let go of something. Let it go like a held breath. And Louisa watched him and thought about a little boy who had sat alone at a supper table keeping a place for someone who had not yet come, and she felt the love she had for this child, both of them, all three of them, with a completeness that did not feel like it had limits she could find. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing is, and the Cimarron Valley in the late 1890s was not without its hardships. There were drought years, and there were cattle sicknesses, and there were the grinding economic pressures that the Depression of 1893 had sent rippling outward through the economy of the American West in ways that did not resolve quickly. There were arguments, real ones, in which Andrew's cold temper and Louisa's sharp-edged certainty came into honest, adult collision, and which required the same skills they brought to everything else, honesty and patience and the willingness to be wrong and say so. There was a year, 1897, in which a bad winter followed by a terrible spring sickness killed more than a third of the Bancroft herd, and which required the full measure of everything both of them had, the accounts restructured and the belt tightened and the work doubled, and not once during it did either of them consider that the decision they had made 3 years prior had been a mistake. Dory's health declined in 1898, and he retired to live with his sister in Taos, and they replaced him with a young man named Gabriel who turned out to be skilled and reliable. Tomas stayed. Tomas seemed, by silent and mutual agreement, to have become a permanent feature of the Bancroft ranch, and Louisa was quietly glad of this because he was the most competent person she had ever watched work, and because Thomas, at 3, had decided Tomas was the most fascinating individual in the world and followed him around with a devotion that Tomas bore with tremendous patience and evident pleasure. Caleb turned 10 in 1897, then 12, then 14. His education had become, by those years, a genuine concern, because he had advanced far beyond what Louisa could offer him, which was saying something, and what Andrew could offer him, and the schooling in Cimarron was not adequate for what this particular mind required. They discussed it seriously and extensively, Andrew and Louisa, in the way they discussed serious things, not quickly but honestly, and what they arrived at was the decision to look at possibilities. In 1898, a formal school had been established in Cimarron with a proper teacher, a young man named Elias Brandt who had come from an Eastern college, and who, it turned out, was exactly the right person for Caleb at exactly the right time. Brandt recognized immediately what he was dealing with, told Andrew and Louisa directly that Caleb should be thinking about university in 3 or 4 years, and proceeded to teach him as if this were already decided. Andrew and Louisa had a private conversation about this that lasted 2 evenings and arrived, finally, at the conclusion that Brandt was right, that the money could be managed, and that they were going to do it. They told Caleb on a Sunday evening in the spring of 1899, when he was 12 and Thomas was nearly 4 and the mountains were still carrying snow on the high peaks and the valley was the particular shade of green that it only achieved in May. Caleb listened to them with his adult stillness, and when they finished he said, "I know I would have to go to Santa Fe or Denver." "Yes," Andrew said. "I know that is a cost," Caleb said. He looked at his father, then at Louisa. "I do not want to be a cost." "You are not a cost," Andrew said, with the flatness that came into his voice when he was saying something absolutely certain. "You are a Bancroft. This ranch exists to give you something to stand on, not to keep you on it." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at Louisa. "Do you agree?" he asked her. "With everything he said," she replied. Caleb nodded once with the dignity of someone who has been given a gift they know how to accept and said, "Then I will study hard enough to deserve it." He did. In 1899, Louisa found she was expecting again. The news arrived with her usual presentation of it, which was direct and before dawn at the kitchen window, though this time she did not have to say it because Andrew was already looking at her when she turned from the window, and his expression said he already knew. "February." He said. "March," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her, which he did with exactly the same care and thoroughness as everything else, and held her for a moment in the kitchen with the lamp burning and the mountains dark outside the window, and she felt the full, settled, unambiguous weight of it, of this life, of this particular form of rightness. Their second child was born in March of 1900, as the new century began, and was a girl, small and fierce-looking from the first moment, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's determination. They named her Clara Louisa Bancroft, and nobody said it was a brave choice or a difficult one, because it was simply the right name, and Andrew held his daughter for the first time with an expression that was entirely beyond his control. Caleb was 13 by then, and had been present when Thomas was born and had managed that with equanimity, but Clara undid him completely. He came into the room, looked at the baby in his stepmother's arms and sat down on the floor without warning, which was the most unplanned thing Louisa had ever seen him do. "Are you all right?" she asked. "She is very small," he said from the floor. "She was larger a few hours ago," Louisa said. "This is an improvement." Caleb sat on the floor and looked at his sister with an expression so unguarded and young that Louisa had to look at the ceiling briefly. Thomas, who was 4.5 and had been deeply skeptical of the baby premise since it was introduced to him, came and stood next to Caleb on the floor and looked at Clara with an expression of revised assessment. "She is acceptable," Thomas said finally. "High praise," Andrew said. "She has Mama's eyes," Thomas said. "She does," Andrew said. Thomas sat down on the floor next to Caleb, and the two of them sat together on the floor of the bedroom and looked at their sister. And Louisa looked at them looking at her. And Andrew stood in the doorway and looked at all of it, all of them. And his expression was the one she had first seen on their wedding day and had seen many times since, the wholly unguarded version of him that he kept for moments when he was unable to maintain anything else. She caught his eye from across the room, and he met her gaze and held it, and she saw, as clearly as she had ever seen anything, that he was exactly as happy as she was, and that this was precisely what the word meant. The years continued. They continued in the good, full, textured way of lives that are genuinely being lived rather than merely endured. The ranch stabilized and then grew, carefully and without overextension, because Louisa was too good at accounts to permit overextension. The cattle operation expanded by modest, considered degrees, and Andrew brought in better breeding stock in 1901 that improved the herd materially over the following years. Tomas, who was by then as much a part of the ranch as the land itself, eventually partnered with a woman named Estrella from Cimarron, and they built a small house on the east side of the property. And Estrella became the closest thing to a friend Louisa had in the valley, a friendship that operated through mutual respect and practical assistance, and the specific warmth of two women who had both chosen their lives deliberately and were not apologetic about it. Caleb went to Santa Fe in 1902 at 15 to attend a proper preparatory school, which he had earned through 3 years of work that justified every word of Elias Brandt's confidence. He went with his father's large hands and his mother Clara's brave decision-making and Louisa's absolute precision of mind, and he wrote home every week without fail, letters that arrived with a regularity and detail that made Louisa think of another series of letters and feel, privately, a full-circle satisfaction. Thomas grew up with the land in his blood in a way that was different from Caleb, deeper and less articulate and more complete. He knew the ranch the way you know your own body, from the inside, and he worked it with a natural authority that made even experienced hands step back and reassess when he was 10. He was Andrew's child in the most literal sense of the ranch, though he was Louisa's in the realm of numbers and stubborn precision. Clara was, from the beginning, simply herself, which was a considerable person to be. She was fierce and funny, and had an interior landscape that revealed itself in unexpected directions, and she and Louisa read together from the time Clara could hold a book, and their arguments about what they read were the most entertaining things that happened on the ranch in any given week, according to Andrew, who watched them with profound amusement. In 1903, when Andrew was 50 and Louisa was nearly 40 and Caleb was 16 away at school, and Thomas was nearly 8 and Clara was 3, and the ranch was in the best condition it had ever been in, something happened that Louisa had not entirely expected. Andrew came in from the range one evening in October and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with the expression that was, by now, completely familiar in all its variations, and this was the one that meant he had something to say and was turning it around in the careful way. She gave him coffee and sat across from him and waited. "Caleb wants to study law," he said. She had known this was coming vaguely from the direction of Caleb's letters over the past year. "Yes," she said. "In Denver," Andrew said. "There is a proper university course now." "Yes," she said again. He looked at the coffee cup. "That is a very long way." "It is," she said. "It is also," he said, with the particular precision he used when he was saying the thing underneath the thing he had been saying, exactly right for him. Louisa looked at him across the table. "I have been thinking," she said, "that we should go to Denver with him when he starts, the 4 of us, see him settled." Andrew looked up. "A trip to Denver. We have not been anywhere since we married," she said. "The accounts are strong. Gabriel and Tomas can manage 2 weeks." She met his eyes steadily. "I think it would be good for all of us." He considered this for a full 30 seconds, which was quick for him on a significant decision. "Yes," he said. "Yes." She raised an eyebrow. "I am capable of quick decisions when the evidence is unambiguous," he said. She laughed. She laughed with the unguarded, genuine quality that she had learned over 9 years was one of the sounds he listened for. They went to Denver in the spring of 1904, all five of them, on the train, which was an adventure in itself because neither Thomas nor Clara had ever been on a train. Clara took to it with imperious delight. Thomas assessed it with the critical engineering eye of a boy who wanted to know how things worked and interrogated the conductor with such focused and detailed questions that the man eventually answered every single one simply to get ahead of the next. Caleb watched his younger siblings with an expression of older brother tolerance and private amusement, and Andrew sat next to Louisa on the train with their shoulders touching, looking out the window as the mountains gave way to the plains. And they talked, the easy, extensive, specific way they had learned to talk, about everything and nothing, about what they saw and what they thought about it, and she felt the accumulated richness of 9 years of knowing him like something you could hold in both hands. Denver had changed. Louisa had not been back since she left, since the collapsed silver market and the rented room and the coffee house table on a Tuesday morning, and she walked its streets with the slightly disorienting quality of returning to a place that has continued existing in your absence and grown in directions you did not anticipate. She showed Andrew the coffee house. She showed him the building where she had worked. She told him about the Tuesday morning and the advertisement and the 3 times she had read it. "And you told yourself you were not going to write," he said. "Repeatedly," she said. He looked at the coffee house window. "I am glad you were not persuaded." She looked at him sideways. "You placed the advertisement twice," she said. "The same text 2 weeks apart." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes. You were not confident it would work." He met her gaze. "No," he said. "I was not." A pause. "But I believed it was worth trying." She took his arm, there on the Denver street in the April sun, with the city moving around them and their children somewhere ahead arguing about whether to stop for a meal or continue to the university district, and she thought about trying and believing it was worth it and keeping the place set. "I think," she said, "that you may be the bravest person I know." He looked at her with some surprise which was rare enough to be notable. "Why?" "Because you are not brave by instinct," she said. "You are careful by instinct, which means every brave thing you do having fully understood what it costs, which is harder." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her. Then he said, "You told me once in one of your letters that you had stopped believing in certain things, that you had set them aside as impractical." "I remember," she said. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I consider it the greatest fortune of my life that they were not, in fact, impractical." She tightened her hand on his arm and did not say anything for a moment, because some things did not need words, and they had both learned this. They got Caleb settled at the university, in a boarding house near the campus that Louisa inspected with the thoroughness of a general assessing fortifications, and whose landlady she interviewed with the directness of a woman who has been managing practical matters for a decade and has refined the skill. The landlady, a Mrs. Hobart, looked at Louisa with the expression of someone encountering a force of nature and decided, wisely, to meet her terms. On their last evening in Denver before the train home, they all had supper together, the 5 of them in a proper restaurant, and Caleb sat at the head of the table because he was 17 and leaving for something larger, and Thomas and Clara argued about the menu, and Andrew ate his supper with the specific contentment of a man who knows exactly where he is and why, and Louisa looked around the table at all of them, at this collection of people who were hers and whom she was. And she felt something that had no word better than complete. After supper, walking back to the hotel with Clara asleep on Andrew's shoulder and Thomas walking very precisely on the edge of the boardwalk with his arms out for balance, she said to Andrew quietly, "Do you remember the evening I arrived at the ranch?" "In detail," he said. "You came in from the barn carrying the stew pot and you stopped when you saw me," she said. "Yes," he said. "What were you thinking?" she asked. He walked a few steps in the quiet of the Denver evening, past the gas lamps and the storefronts, with their sleeping daughter on his shoulder, and their son balanced on the boardwalk edge ahead of them. "I was thinking," he said finally, "that I had been keeping that place at the table for 6 months and I had not let myself fully believe, that anyone would come and sit in it. And there you were." He glanced at her. "I was thinking that I had been more afraid than I knew." "And," she said. "And then you apologized for being late," he said. "And I thought that you were not apologetic by nature and that you were apologizing because you thought you should and not because you meant it. And I thought that was precisely right, and I was not afraid after that." She stopped walking. He stopped too, with Clara shifting slightly against his shoulder and Thomas still ahead on the boardwalk, oblivious. "You knew that from the apology," she said. "I knew who you were from your letters," he said. "The apology confirmed it." She looked at him for a long moment in the gas lamp light. This man with the gray at his temples and the broken nose and the scar on his hand and the most careful eyes she had ever looked into. And she thought about all of it. The advertisement and the letters and the plate on the table and the ankle and the kitchen conversation and the ranch and the accounts and the winter and the baby and the children and the years and the years. And the way love, real love, the kind that holds, is not a single moment but a long continuous thing, an active keeping, a setting of places in good faith. "Thomas," she called. The boy stopped his boardwalk balance. "Yes, Mama." "Stay close," she said. "Yes, Mama," he said, and dropped down from the boardwalk edge and came back to walk beside them, and took her hand because he was nearly 9 and still did this without embarrassment, which she treasured. They walked back to the hotel together, the 4 of them, with Clara dreaming against her father's shoulder and Thomas swinging Louisa's hand and the Denver night settling around them. And she felt, as she had learned to feel, the particular wholeness of a life that had been chosen, piece by piece, with full awareness of what it cost. The train took them home the next morning, south and west, back toward the mountains, and as the Sangre de Cristos came into sight, those specific shapes against the sky that she could now read the same way she read faces, Thomas pressed his nose against the window and said, "There it is." "Yes," Andrew said. "Does it look different when you have been away?" Thomas asked. Andrew looked at the mountains for a moment. "It looks like what it is," he said, "which is home." They arrived at the ranch in the early evening, and Tomas and Estrella and Gabriel came out to meet them, and there was the particular commotion of return, of bags and animals and the house opening up again after 10 days of absence, and in the middle of it all, Louisa walked through the front door and stopped. The table was set. All the places were set, candles lit, bread on the plates, water glasses full. Estrella appeared at the kitchen door. "We thought you would be hungry when you arrived," she said simply. Louisa stood in the doorway and looked at the candlelit table and the set places and felt, with a fullness she had no words adequate to, the life she had walked into 9 years ago on a dusty evening with her coat torn and her hair unpinned, when a small boy with a napkin folded in his lap had told her that his father had been keeping her place ready. Andrew came up behind her and stopped when he saw the table. She felt his hand come to rest at the small of her back, light and steady. "Estrella kept the table," she said. "Yes," he said. "The way you kept mine," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood in the doorway together, and Thomas pushed past them both with a 7-year-old's complete disregard for the moment. And Clara, still half asleep, needed to be carried to her room, and the ranch returned to its living self around them, noise and warmth and the smell of bread and candles, and Andrew's hand stayed at the small of her back through all of it. Later, much later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the lamp on the kitchen table cast its familiar circle of light, they sat across from each other the way they had sat on that 4th week evening when she had told him it was more than a practical arrangement, and she looked at him and he looked at her and nothing needed to be said, which was, she had come to understand, the highest luxury of a long and honest love. "I am glad," she said, "that I wrote the letter." He looked at her steadily. "I am glad," he said, "that I placed the advertisement twice." She raised her coffee cup and he raised his, and they held each other's gaze across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, in the house that was theirs, with the mountains outside and the children sleeping and the years ahead of them still. And she thought about all the people she had been before this. The careful, defended, practical woman who had told herself that hope was an expense she could not afford. And she thought about the evening she had walked into this house and found a small boy keeping her place with a seriousness that broke her heart open. And she thought about all the evenings since, all the set places and the kept faith and the active, tended, unconditional love of a man who had waited without certainty because he believed, because he had decided to believe. And she thought that perhaps that was all it ever was, all love ever was, the decision to keep the place ready. The candles burned in the kitchen of the Bancroft ranch house. The mountains stood outside the window as they had always stood. And Louisa Bancroft, who had once been practical above all things, sat across the table from the man who had placed her name in the newspaper and kept her chair pulled out and her plate set through 6 months of evenings when she had not yet arrived, and was glad with everything she had that she had come. In the spring of 1905, with Caleb well established at his law studies in Denver and writing letters full of the precise, serious intelligence that had always been his, and with Thomas 9 years old and already more at home on the range than inside any building, and with Clara 4 and beginning to show the reading appetite that Louisa had been hoping for, Andrew came to Louisa one morning at her desk where she was working on the accounts and set a paper in front of her. She looked at it. It was a land deed. An adjacent parcel to the east, 300 acres of good grazing land with a stream running through it, which had belonged to an elderly rancher named Bowers who had died in January without heirs. It had been sitting with the Territorial Land Office since February. "You want to acquire it," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the figures she had been working with. She turned the pages, ran the numbers in her head the way she always did, checking them twice because she was Louisa and twice was minimum. "We can do it," she said, "if we structure the payment across 3 years. "Yes," he said. She looked up at him. "You already knew we could do it." "I wanted your opinion," he said. "You wanted my agreement," she said. "Those are not different things," he said. She looked at him for a moment at the complete undefended honesty of the statement and felt the love she had for him with its usual precision and entirety. "Make the offer," she said. He made the offer. The land became theirs by summer. By the time Thomas Bancroft was 12, he knew every inch of those 300 acres as well as the original land, and considered the stream that ran through them his particular domain, and spent hours in its vicinity that he always reported, innocently, as ranch work, which it was, partly. Caleb came home for the summers and for Christmas, and each time he came back he was more completely himself and less the contained, old before-his-time child he had been when Louisa first knew him. And she thought this was the result of many things, of education and time and friends, and the expansion that comes from encountering the wider world. But she also thought it was the result of having had, for 11 years, a home that held him steadily whether he was in it or not. He came home the way people come to a thing they trust, without the anxiety of needing to check whether it is still there. In 1907, Caleb graduated from his law program, 21 years old and serious and capable, and came home to Cimarron with his degree and opened a law office on the main street, the first formal legal office in the town's history, and within 6 months had more work than he could manage because the Cimarron Valley had a great deal of legal need and had never had anyone to meet it properly. The day his office opened, the whole family went to see it. Andrew stood in the doorway of his eldest son's office in the town of Cimarron, looking at the shelved law books and the clean desk, and the sign on the door that said CALEB BANCROFT, Attorney AT Law, and his expression was so completely beyond his usual management that Louisa did not look at him directly, out of courtesy. Thomas stood in the middle of the office and turned around slowly, looking at the books. "There are a lot of rules," he said. "That is what law is," Caleb said. "I prefer cattle," Thomas said. "I know," Caleb said. "It is fortunate that we are different." Clara, 7 years old, was already reading the titles on the book's spines with intense concentration. "Can women be lawyers?" she asked in the tone of a child who is asking for information relevant to planning. A silence in the office. Caleb crouched down to her level. "Not easily," he said, with the honesty he had learned from both his parents. "Not yet, but things are changing and I believe they will change more." Clara looked at the bookshelves. "Then I will wait until they do," she said, with a patience and certainty that sounded remarkably like her father. On the walk home from Caleb's office, Andrew and Louisa walked slightly behind the children who had run ahead, and the afternoon light lay golden across the Cimarron street, and the mountains were the deep blue of late September in New Mexico, and the air had the quality that particular altitude and season create, clear and cool and enormous. "She will do it," Louisa said. "Yes," Andrew said, "she will." "It will be harder than it should be," Louisa said. "Yes," he said. "But she has the kind of patience that is not the same as passivity. She knows the difference." He looked at Louisa. "She learned it from you." Louisa walked beside him in the September light. "She learned it from us," she said. He took her hand. He was not a publicly demonstrative man. He had not changed in this respect since she met him, and she had never expected him to. But he took her hand on the main street of Cimarron on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1907 and held it, and walked beside her in the golden light with their children running ahead and their eldest son's name newly painted on a door behind them, and she thought that this was what it meant to arrive. Not the moment she stepped through his front door in 1894, though that had been the beginning, not any single moment after it. But the accumulated, continuous arriving, the showing up every day, the keeping of places, the tending of faith. She held his hand. The mountains stood in the clear September air. Thomas called something to Clara from ahead, and Clara answered with the precise authority of a small person who knows exactly what she thinks. Caleb's sign caught the light somewhere behind them. And Louisa Bancroft, who had once stood in a doorway and seen her place already set at a stranger's table, walked forward into the afternoon with her husband beside her and felt, with every step and in every direction, utterly and completely and irrevocably home. There was one more thing that happened, years later, that completed the circle in a way she had not anticipated. It was 1910. Thomas was 15. Clara was 10. Caleb was 24 and had a growing law practice and was, Louisa suspected with private and satisfied amusement, beginning to look with a certain attention at a young woman from Rayado who had come to his office twice about a property matter with more composure and directness than any business necessity quite required. Andrew was 57, still working the ranch with the same physicality, though Louisa had learned to read the evenings when his back hurt, which he would not say directly but which she could see, and she managed this through the strategic deployment of hot water and the practiced application of saying nothing directly. It was a November evening. Thomas and Clara were both home, one at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts that he was beginning to learn, one on the floor with a book, which was where Clara lived, and Andrew was outside doing the last evening check, which was his habit every night of every year regardless of weather. Louisa was setting the supper table. She set 5 places, though Caleb was in town and not expected. She set them the way the table had always been set in the Bancroft house, candles lit, bread placed, water glasses full, every place ready. Thomas looked up from the accounts. He was 15, dark-haired and large-shouldered like his father and watchful like his mother, and he looked at the 5 set places with the specific attention of someone who notices things. "Caleb is not coming tonight," he said. "No," Louisa said. "Then why is his place set?" She smoothed the cloth at Caleb's place and straightened the fork and looked at her son across the candle-lit table. "Because the table should be ready," she said simply. "In case." Thomas looked at the set place for a moment. Then he looked at his mother, and in his face, in his 15-year-old face that was so much his father's and so much its own, she saw the understanding arrive. He did not say anything else. He went back to the accounts. Clara looked up from her book on the floor. "Did Papa do that for you?" she asked. "Before you came?" "He did," Louisa said. Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to matters that interested her. "He kept your place even when you had not yet arrived," she said. "Yes," Louisa said. "That is very good," Clara said, in the tone she used for things she intended to remember. Then the back door opened and Andrew came in from the evening check, cold-cheeked and steady, and he looked at the table with its 5 set places and then at Louisa, and she met his eyes across the kitchen and saw, as clearly as she had always seen it, the fullness of what they had made together. He sat down at his place. She sat down at hers. Thomas closed the accounts ledger. Clara put her book aside. The candles burned on the table. Outside, the Sangre de Cristo mountains stood in the November dark as they had always stood, indifferent to time and faithful as ground, and in the house at their feet the Bancroft family sat down to supper. All places set, all people present. Home.